first want to express my appreciation for those who organized this meeting. Someone was saying, why not in JNU? And I thought, well, there should be one in JNU, but I think it's also appropriate that there is a meeting outside JNU, because he was much more than JNU.
There was one in JNU.
Yeah, so I wasn't informed, though I'd asked to be informed. So that's, I guess I went through a period of parting pangs when I left JNU, but maybe I shouldn't have gone through them. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. And actually, much of what I want to say, I think, has been elaborated much more by the earlier speakers. I have a few points which I would like to just put forward here, and I've taken the chair's prerogative to speak first. Of course, one's here to celebrate Professor Oommen's life and legacy. One's here to express our respects for him. And when I think about him, the first thing, especially when you look at the slideshow and all the books that he's written, to me, he's the epitome of what another dear professor said. He said, professors never retire. This was Professor JPS said it to me. Somebody was saying, oh, how is so-and-so to be introduced as a retired professor? He said, professors never retire. Because professors, and I think this was true of Professor Oommen, always love to speak, to be heard, to listen, to write, to read. I remember at one point when he was asked to come to the Department of Sociology to speak at a conference we were having at that time as part of our Golden Jubilee. He said, yeah, I'll speak, but I need all these books. And one of my colleagues had to get all those books to him so he could go through them and look through them. When I think of Professor Oommen also, for me, it's essentially in two phases. One of those who were his students. I think I was maybe the third batch of the MA. I don't know, Geetha, you were the second batch. There was a previous batch. So I was the third batch. And I think the very first lecture in sociology which I heard, with the first course of the day, very difficult for me to get there, but I did, was Professor Oommen, teaching sociological thinkers. Durkheim, Weber, Marx. And as Maitrayee pointed out, very structured. It made us a little scared, but still very structured, and there would be this break he would take every so often. And he'd look around at us, and we weren't sure if he was looking at us to see if we were paying attention. And it was like, okay, sit up straight. You better make sure he thinks you're paying attention. Professor Oommen, as many people have already said, has been a pioneering sociologist. A pioneering sociologist in terms of Indian sociology and in terms of the social sciences. Which meant, that when I then joined the profession, I would be looking at him both as having been his student and as a very junior colleague, maybe dodging him at conferences, maybe going up to him. But when I try and put those two things together, there are certain themes which come to me. I was his direct student for only 2 years. And I'd say I'm direct, though I wasn't ever his his research student, because in that class, we were so few, and he would be looking at us. His direct student, I see many of his students who have subsequently gone on to be my colleagues across the University of Delhi. So his role as a teacher was clearly very critical. I remember going from Durkheim in the lecture room and then a tutorial. And we were supposed to have a discussion, and I was supposed to write a tutorial essay on Durkheim, division of labor. Young, headstrong, thinking we've already seen it all. We, of course, hadn't seen anything. But, JNU at that time, it was the emergency years, 75 to 77. People would say that, oh, emergency, but it was in ferment, the university, even at that time. Political activity was subterranean. So we would be distributing leaflets, holding our hearts in our sort of chests, scared while we are doing it, and then going off to the classes as though everything was normal, and it was normal. And when I was listening to those lectures, I came from physics, okay? So people might think that from physics it's very easy, but for me they were very dense. I was having to listen to words rather than formulae. I was having to take that in. And it's at times I realize now from my own experience, but also the first class is Marx, Durkheim, first Durkheim, then Weber, then Marx. How often I think back and I think we forgot what it was like as students when we started teaching, and realizing how we had to make things less dense. Not because Oommen was making them dense. He was not, and I'm sorry, I should say Professor Oommen, but as students, when I'm talking about him as a student, I will say Oommen, because that's how we talked about him at that time. We referred to all our teachers by their surnames, not like they do today by their first names. We were respectful enough to use their surnames.
Was Oommen his surname?
As far as we were concerned, TK wasn't a surname. Okay?
Was Matthew's brother's name.
Yeah, but okay, anyway, we can discuss that later. The North Indian arrogance, North Indian lack of knowledge, whatever it is, the colonial training, the initials are never the surname. So, Oommen, we used Oommen as though it was his surname. Thank you, Surinder. I will not say Jodhka. Now, actually, since the news and then this meeting, many of my classmates and my batch have also been remembering him. And in one sense, I almost feel like I'm a representative of that batch, the 75-77 sociology batch. And they're all remembering his unique style of teaching. Marx, Durkheim, Weber, the texts, taking us through the text, taking us through the approaches. But what I'd actually started talking about was this tutorial. Division of labor. So I go there, present it, and then I go on, of course, to immediately jump into my critique of Durkheim. And my critique of Durkheim, essentially that, he was a functionalist who wished to maintain the social order, and he saw what was integral to capitalism as just a minor part of it. Professor Oommen listened to me, listened carefully, and said, okay. And then he pushed me to substantiate. I couldn't just say it. I had to substantiate. And I think that was a teaching which remained with me when I became a teacher. And I would insist that students, even though there was a text which it was very fashionable to thrash, if they were going to take it up, they first had to present the text in the terms of the writer. And they had to first give an internal critique before they took another vantage point. And I think that's something I learned from him. Now, like Maitrayee, Professor Oommen and I had different approaches. But what was important was that he did listen and respect, maybe occasionally make a remark which I, of course, would not be able to defend, and I'd feel a little ridiculed, but then I'd also feel, okay, now I have to go further. Actually, in JNU, I think in all our classes with all our teachers, other than why sing, we could argue. We would ask in the class and we would argue. And I think it was to do, of course, not just with CSSS, it was to do with the times, it was to do with what JNU was at that time. Because as I said, at the one hand, political action was not on, but the ferment was everywhere. We were constantly talking, discussing. And again, something which I learned there, and I would tell my students, I'd say, don't think you're going to get everything in the classroom. You're going to get it by going and sitting with your colleagues and talking to them and discussing with them. And then we would bring that back into the classroom, the tutorial, the lecture. And of course, Professor Oommen would know that there's been this discussion. He would know from the way we are saying it that there's been this discussion outside and we are bringing it in. Fine. But now substantiate what you want to say. So I think a number of people have made this point. With Professor Oommen, you could differ. He would respect that you had that difference. He may have thought you were wrong. He would indicate it, but not in a way to completely shut you up. That did not happen. And of course, we were headstrong and young, and I think we needed somebody to push us to also learn to read. But I think what was also important was that in terms of those texts, in terms of those times, these are texts which are, and I'm focusing particularly on this course. This was a course which was macro sociology, Durkheim, Weber, Marx. And at the same time, we needed that macro sociology where a lot of the other sociology was micro. We needed those macro perspectives to think about the world we were in. And that is also something which one carried. Now, moving on to the other sort of theme through which arena in which I would know him, and I'll try, and I'm speaking longer than I thought I would, thanks to you, which was as not the lecturer, not the teacher, but a person who taught through his text, who taught through his writing, through his research. And I'm thinking of particularly two areas of his work. One is on social movements, and the other is what many people have mentioned, his work on state, civil society, minorities, and pluralism. And one thing I think which came through both of them in different ways was the importance of looking at social and political processes. The idea of the process came through. Now, his initial work was on the Bhudan movement, which was both a movement, a Gandhian movement, and a social reform movement. He went on to then do two texts on social movements. And I remember at that time, he called me up, made me come and meet him, and insisted, though I tried to get out of it, insisted that I did an article on the women's movement for that book. And I said, okay, I have this, but I don't have the script. He said, I will have it typed out and give it to you, and you better sit and write it. He refused to take an answer, no. And I think it was so important because he knew we didn't have the same approaches, but he wasn't trying to get people to write with the same approach. He was trying to cover various different movements, various different sectors. And those two volumes then, I think, was something which also helped me break a fallow period, and also brought in something again which was important in terms of the sociology. Now, when one looks at the many dimensions of what he's written and worked, one of the things is, and in my story, how he tried to push younger colleagues and push the boundaries of the discipline. And I think what was very important was that in Indian sociology, one of the speakers earlier mentioned this, there were these gaps in terms of looking at state, in terms of looking at civil society, the relationship between them, the minorities and pluralism, and he was bringing those in. And those were writings I drew on not for my research, but in my teaching, when I taught political sociology, when I taught the sociology of India. But when I put all these things together, I think two or three things stand out about Professor Oommen. His deep belief in democracy, in democratic modes of interaction, and in democratic rights, and his deep belief in a plural, diverse society, that it was good for the society, it was good for us, his belief and in secularism, and it was a belief it was a belief as a citizen, and it was a belief in terms of the value he saw it as having in society and necessary for society. So I think one of the things which, if you're thinking about his life and legacy, which we think of, is how not only were these issues important, they are even more important today. The struggle for democracy, thinking about democracy in our work, the struggle for a plural society, thinking about how pluralism and the processes of democracy and pluralism can work. So I want to express my condolences to his family, to his friends, his colleagues, all his students, and say that with those condolences, of course, we have to think about the struggles ahead in terms of our discipline and in terms of our society.